My parents convinced my husband he deserved better, and they all left me, but 3 years later, they were shocked to see me with a baby girl. 3 years ago, my world was turned upside down. My parents convinced my husband that he deserved better than me simply because I couldn't give them the grandkids they wanted. They all left me and I was left feeling broken. Fast forward 3 years and their jaws dropped when they saw me with a beautiful baby girl. So I'm 30 years old now, and just recently I ran into my parents and my ex-husband, Scott, who was 33. It was a strange and unexpected encounter, and honestly, I'm not sure how I feel about it. To give you some context, I haven't spoken to my parents or Scott in almost 3 years, ever since our divorce. I did everything I could to avoid them because the emotional toll they took on me was too much. Back when we were all still together, they destroyed my mental health to the point where I felt like I didn't even deserve to exist. After the divorce, I moved to the suburbs and focused on building a new life far away from them and the painful memories they left behind. So bumping into them recently was a huge shock. And yeah, I said some things that maybe weren't the best, but at the moment, I couldn't hold back. My parents had always wanted a son, and while they didn't treat me badly growing up, it was clear they would have treated me differently if I had been born a boy. My mom even said as much a few times. I tried so hard to be the son they never had, but of course, I couldn't change who I was. Even after college, when I moved out and got my own place, I still tried to stay connected with them. They were the only family I had. I wasn't close to my grandparents, and I didn't have any uncles or aunts who could fill that gap. So despite how distant my parents could be, I clung to the hope that we could have a relationship. Even when it seemed like they didn't care much about me, I kept reaching out. Then when I was around 23, I met Scott. We hit it off instantly after meeting at a concert. After 6 months of dating, I introduced him to my parents. And that's when something strange happened suddenly. They started making more of an effort to be in my life. They called me more often, asked about my relationship, and seemed genuinely interested in what was going on with me. At first, I didn't question it because it felt nice. My parents were finally showing interest in me, and it made me happy. It felt like we were one big happy family, something I had always dreamed of. Looking back now, I wish I had questioned their sudden change, but at the time, I was just too happy to see the truth. After dating Scott for a little over 2 years, we got engaged, married, and then my world fell apart. After 3 wonderful years together, Scott and I got engaged. Shortly after that, we were married, and for a while, everything was perfect. I was enjoying my life as a newlywed. However, 6 months after the wedding, my parents began dropping hints about wanting a grandchild. I was only 26 at the time, and I didn't feel ready for that responsibility just yet. I wanted to wait a couple more years before thinking about kids, but because of their constant pressure, I decided to talk to Scott about it. To my surprise, he was all for the idea of starting a family right away. His enthusiasm was contagious, so we agreed to start trying for a baby soon after our marriage. We tried for a long time, but after several months with no success, we started to worrying. Something didn't feel right, so we decided to get tested. That's when we found out I was infertile. The news hit us both hard, but what was even more painful was how disappointed my parents were. They didn't even try to hide it. When we broke the news to both our parents, my dad walked out of the room instead of offering any kind of support. It was like I didn't even matter in that moment. Instead of comforting me, all they cared about was the fact that I couldn't give them a grandchild. Scott and I talked about other options, like IVF, but we knew it would be expensive and there was no guarantee it would work on the first try. So we decided to put the idea of starting a family on hold until we had saved enough money to afford it. We were upset, but we made peace with our decision. My parents, however, were not at peace. They stopped visiting, stopped calling, and completely shut me out. No matter how much I tried to explain that it wasn't my fault, they refused to listen. Weeks went by, and their coldness hurt me deeply. I finally reached my breaking point. I called my parents and let out all my frustration. I told them how cruel they had been, treating me so harshly just because I couldn't have a child at that moment. I even questioned whether they'd be good grandparents if I ever did have kids. I reminded them that they had treated me unfairly my whole life simply because I wasn't born a boy. For years, I had tried to ignore their favoritism towards Scott, hoping to keep our relationship intact, but I was done pretending. I told them I no longer wanted to be in contact with them and that it would be best if they stayed out of my life for good. Saying those words was incredibly difficult because, for so long, all I had wanted was their approval. But I finally realized that their approval was impossible to get. Instead of apologizing or showing any regret, they doubled down on their behavior. They were perfectly fine with not speaking to me again. To them, I was worthless as a woman since I couldn't have children, and they made it clear they didn't want anything to do with me. Hearing that from my own parents shattered me, but at least now I knew where I stood with them. After that phone call, I cut off contact with my parents for good. When I told Scott about what had happened, he was supportive at first, but then after a few days, I started to notice a change in him. He was distant and I could sense something was off. I tried to ignore it because I was already going through so much emotionally, but deep down, I feared that even my husband was about to walk out on me too. Pretending everything was fine until he showed up with divorce papers. I tried to act like everything was fine, even though deep down I knew something was wrong. Scott had become distant and cold, a completely different person from the man I had married. I did everything I could to save our relationship. I put in all the effort I had, but nothing worked. After a few months of trying to hold things together, Scott came home with divorce paper. He told me he was done with our marriage. As much as I had feared this would happen, it still hurt deeply. I tried reasoning with him, saying we could still try for a baby later, that we didn't have to give up. But he brushed me off. He said there were a lot of reasons he wanted to leave, but he didn't want to talk about them. He just wanted it all to be over as soon as possible because it was hard for both of us. The divorce process took nearly 7 months to finalize, and it was the toughest time of my life. I felt completely alone and broken. Then, just weeks after Scott had moved out, I learned something that made it all worse. Scott was living with my parents. I couldn't believe it and I didn't know what to do. I tried talking to his parents, my in-laws, to get some answers. They told me that my parents had been in contact with Scott for months. From what they understood, my parents had somehow convinced Scott that he deserved better than me, pushing him to leave. My in-laws didn't support his decision and they had even fought over it. Scott had cut off communication with them as well. I didn't know the full details of what my parents had said to Scott, but I was told that they had implied he deserved someone better. I guess they were desperate to have a son in any way they could. Since I wasn't speaking to them and wouldn't be giving them a grandchild, they decided to take Scott under their wing and convinced him to leave me. After the divorce, I was shattered. It took me months to start picking up the pieces of my life, but eventually I did it. I moved out of my house and into the suburbs. I found a new job, changed my appearance, and cut off all contact with Scott and my parents. I blocked them on social media and told all my old friends and family members that I didn't want to hear anything about them ever again. They respected my wishes. For the past 3 years, I've been focused on healing. I've been in therapy and working hard to rebuild my life. I was doing well, but there was still something missing: a baby. Even though I no longer had a husband or parents in my life, I still wanted to be a mother. I felt ready. Last year, I began IVF treatments with the help of an anonymous donor, and I finally got pregnant. For months ago, the moment I bumped into my past, I gave birth to my beautiful baby girl. Life has been wonderful since she was born, and I'm truly happy. But just 4 days ago, something unexpected happened. I was taking a walk with my baby when I unexpectedly bumped into my parents and Scott. I was completely shocked to see them in my neighborhood. At first, I thought they had come to find me, but I quickly realized they were leaving a house just a couple of blocks away. When they saw me, I froze. I wanted to turn around and head home, but I couldn't move. They walked up to me, greeted me, and immediately asked about the baby. After all, they thought I was infertile. I told them the truth, and by then, I had started to process what was happening. I began walking back toward home, but Scott stopped me. He said he had been thinking about me a lot lately and that bumping into me was a sign from the universe. Apparently, they were visiting Scott's aunt, who had recently moved into the neighborhood, and he took our encounter as a sign that we should give our relationship a second chance. My parents, standing right beside him, chimed in. They urged me to invite them all over to my house so we could catch up and talk about everything they had missed in my life. I was speechless and appalled that they would even suggest something like that. After all that had happened, they thought I would just let them back into my life. It took me 3 long years to heal from the damage they had done. I'm still in therapy, working through all the pain they caused. So I had an outburst. I told them I would rather invite wild animals into my house than let them in because, at least, wild animals would be better company. I told them to stop pretending they cared about me or what was going on in my life. The only reason they wanted to talk to me now was because I had a baby. My parents only cared about getting the grandchild they always wanted, and Scott? Well, he was probably just lonely, unable to find anyone else. He saw that I had managed to get pregnant once, and now he figured he could waltz back into my life and have a second chance at starting a family. It was disgusting. To them, I wasn't a person with feelings, I was just a baby machine. When I needed their emotional support the most, they all abandoned me. I expected it from my parents. They had made it clear throughout my childhood that they valued me less because I wasn't a boy. In their eyes, a woman's only worth was her ability to become a mother. But the real shock was Scott. He had spent years with me, comforting me, standing by my side door, so I thought. But when my parents got in his head, for whatever twisted reason, he left me at my lowest point. I hadn't forgotten any of the hurtful things they said to me. So I told them exactly how I felt the confrontation and the call. I told them that since I was worthless as a woman and Scott deserved better, maybe they should just leave me alone now. Normally, I'm a quiet, shy person, but that day in the street, I was yelling at the top of my lungs. It was 3 years of bottled up anger coming out all at once, and it was ugly. When I finished yelling, I ran back to my house and slammed the door behind me as fast as I could. Afterward, I felt physically sick. I couldn't bring myself to go to work for a few days, so I stayed home with my baby, trying to process everything. The confrontation kept playing over and over in my head. I wasn't sure what to do next. Then last evening, I received a call from an unknown number. Normally, I never answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, but for some reason, I picked up this time. It was Scott in the background. I could hear my parents whispering, not even trying to hide the fact that they were listening in. They clearly wanted me to know they were there. I tried to stay calm. I told Scott not to call me again, and that if he or my parents tried to contact me, I would be forced to take legal steps against them. I didn't want to, but I was ready if they pushed me. I told him I had cut them out of my life 3 years ago, and I intended to keep it that way. But Scott asked me to hear him out. Against my better judgment, I stayed on the line and listened. He admitted that he had messed up, and that my parents had too. He claimed their actions came from a place of disappointment. They had all been looking forward to having a baby in the family, and when they found out I was infertile, they didn't handle it well. He said it was hard for them to accept that I wasn't ready to try IVF because of the financial strain, but now they wanted a second chance to prove they were worthy of being in my life again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him I didn't buy a word of it. The only reason they wanted to reconnect now was because they had seen me with a baby. That was the truth. They didn't care about me as a person, they only cared about me as a way to get a grandchild. I was done pretending otherwise. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard my parents' voices in the background. They said this was exactly the kind of behavior that led them to cut me off. They believed I was selfish, only thinking about myself after finding out I was infertile. Instead of giving everyone space, I kept showing up, wanting them to comfort me and focus on me, even though they were struggling with the news too. That's why they all pushed me away, and I ended up with no one to lean on. I didn't continue the conversation after that, I just hung up. Deep down, I know they were trying to gaslight me. but I still find myself doubting. For my own peace of mind, I feel like I need to ask Ida. After all, I did ask for reassurance when I found out I couldn't have children. Now, let me clarify something a lot of people asked about. Why didn't my parents try for another baby after me? Especially if they wanted a boy so badly. Well, my mom had a tough first pregnancy, and the doctors recommended waiting a few years before trying again. But when she had me, she was already in her mid-30s. Waiting a few more years would have made her pregnancy even riskier. So just like I struggled to conceive and later found out I was infertile, my mom struggled a lot to have me too. The difference was that when she was going through it, her mother-in-law gave her a hard time. But in my case, it was my own mother who couldn't spare any empathy for me. That's why they didn't have another child, they were left with just me, a daughter. I don't really know what kind of relationship Scott had with his parents, but from what I saw, they seemed to get along pretty well. I'm not sure if they've made up after their last falling out, since I haven't spoken to Scott or his parents in a while. Scott was an only child, so there was no competition for attention. Whenever I visited his parents, it was clear they loved him and treated him well throughout his childhood. So I don't understand why he clung to my parents the way he did. With my parents, it made sense they wanted a son, which is why they treated Scott the way they did. But as for Scott, I have no clue what went wrong. For the past 3 years, I've been trying to put all this behind me, so I haven't given it much thought until now. I hadn't really thought about this or questioned it before, but now that you all bring it up, I feel like I need to talk to my ex-in-laws and figure out what's going on. At the very least, my curiosity is getting the better of me. I hope this clears up any doubts people might have. So I decided to reach out to my ex-in-laws to understand why Scott has been acting the way he has. Honestly, I couldn't think of any reason why he'd want to visit his aunt with my parents that felt strange. I knew deep down that this wasn't my fault. They abandoned me when I needed them the most because they're just terrible people. They were trying to gaslight me, and all I wanted was a little reassurance. I didn't want to bother my friends with such personal issues, which is why I posted it here. So thank you to everyone who reassured me and made me realize I wasn't the bad guy in this situation. Reaching out after 3 years of silence was awkward. The last time I spoke to them was around the time of my divorce. Thankfully, they were glad to hear from me. After some small talk, I decided to get straight to the point. I asked them why Scott seemed so close to my parents and whether they had been in touch. They explained that a couple of months after their last fight, Scott and my parents managed to make up and have been in contact. He had stayed connected with my parents too. They told me Scott had been well loved as a child, so it wasn't like he was trying to replace his own parents with mine. But apparently my parents had been pretty shady from the beginning of our relationship. They had been trying to win Scott over. While we were dating, Scott would tell his parents how my parents would invite him to dinner even when I was busy. He enjoyed that attention and thought it was something to brag about, believing he impressed my parents just by being himself. In some ways, he did impress them. Just being a guy was enough. He spent a lot of time alone with my parents without me knowing, and he started seeing them as parental figures. Even though he had his own parents whom he respected, it was all quite complicated. On top of that, my parents would shower him with expensive gifts and constantly write him checks. This was the money Scott once offered to use for IVF while we were together, but I thought he was just bluffing. We didn't have that kind of money back then, and I never wanted him to do anything shady for it. He didn't want to tell me he was getting money from my parents because then he would have to come clean about everything else. The relationship he had with my parents wasn't great, but even then, I refused to consider IVF. I didn't believe he had the financial stability for it, and I wanted to save up. My parents used this as a way to manipulate him. They told him he deserved someone who had faith in him, and after a few months, they managed to convince him to turn against me. That's how he ended up leaving. Later, my ex-in-laws apologized, explaining that while they didn't agree with how Scott was influenced by my parents, he was their only son, and they couldn't just cut him off. I didn't hold it against them. They didn't owe me anything, and they were being kind by telling me the truth. Now that I know what really happened, I have no reason to engage with them. They're toxic people, and I don't want them in my life. Update: after taking almost 2 weeks off, I finally decided to return to work. Fortunately, I still had a lot of maternity leave left, as I hadn't taken the full 6 months all at once. My company has a flexible policy, which is great. At home, it was just my daughter and her nanny, whom I trust completely. She's an amazing woman with solid references, and I know her personally as well. Halfway through the workday, I got a call from her. She told me she had taken my daughter to her house because she didn't feel it was safe to stay in mine thanks to my ex-husband. I agreed, wanting them to be safe. I immediately called the police and started driving home. While we were on the phone, she explained that Scott had been outside for a while, screaming for me to come out. When he realized I wasn't there, he started kicking the door, yelling loudly, and my daughter was crying. Thankfully, my nanny acted quickly and contacted me. I quickly informed the police while the nanny left through the back gate to her house, which was just a few minutes away. That way, I could deal with my ex-husband, and my baby would be safe. Honestly, all the credit goes to her. Her top priority was my daughter's safety, just like it should be. By the time I got home, the cops were already there, and it was clear that Scott had been drinking. It was only noon, but he was already drunk. I was so angry. I decided to press charges and use it as a reason to get a restraining order. He was clearly losing control. The police took him away, and shortly after, my nanny returned with my daughter. I gave her the rest of the day off since I planned to stay home anyway. I might need to take a few more days off work, but honestly, I don't mind. I get to spend that time with my favorite person, my daughter. Update: it's been a few weeks since I last posted. Things got pretty busy with my baby, and I also started a new project, which has been exciting. Here's what's going on with Scott and my parents. Thankfully, I got the restraining order without too much trouble. I had security footage from when Scott showed up drunk, trying to break in, so that helped a lot. Since then, my parents have been keeping their distance. I guess they saw what a mess Scott was and decided not to bother me. My ex-in-laws told me that they've also stopped talking to Scott. Apparently, he's been struggling to find a partner, even though he desperately wants to start a family. He's against adoption, so maybe that's why he acted out the way he did, but that doesn't excuse what he's put me through. I'm not going to forgive him or my parents for all they've done. Even though my parents are staying away, they're still bad-mouthing me to other relatives. It's sad because nobody is buying it. Everyone knows they were the ones who wronged me, and now they're trying to act like they're the victims. That's not how it works, and they've learned that the hard way. The best part is, they'll never get to meet their grandchild. I'm not going to allow it. My daughter and I will live a happy life together without anyone trying to interfere. I'm determined to be a better parent than the ones I had as role models.